Cool. Okay. Sorry for the background noise. Am I good to go?
Yep, all good.
Okay, great. Two pieces of setup. One, to clarify, this motion is about romantic and physical encounters with third parties, i.e., people who you're meeting on dating apps, friends who you might like become closer with, or people who you meet at clubs. This is not about encounters directly with the ex from whom you are trying to move on. Secondly, since this is a this house prefers motion, teams have to give likelihood analysis for how either strategy will manifest, no modeling power from either team. Three arguments. One, why will our strategy asymmetrically be done in good ways which are informed by friends who care for you? Three reasons. One, most people crave social connections with others, even during periods of sadness. They want to vent to others about their shitty ex and take their mind off of their sadness. Meaning, when you don't use time going on dates or going on hookups, you instead spend that freed up time speaking more with your friends about your experiences. And crucially, you lean on your friends in good ways and they're unlikely to get angry at you. Number one, because you have information about which friends will give you the best and most honest advice. And therefore, you know which ones won't be annoyed at you and which ones have the bandwidth to listen to you in this specific moment and self-select into talking to those specific people. But secondly, there are reciprocal expectations that tend to exist in friendships. Presumably, you have also helped your friends during their periods of hardship, so they feel an obligation to care for you. Crucially, even if you can lean on your friends a little bit on their side of the house, there's a substantial temporal trade-off. The best case for them is you go to clubs with your friends and everyone is drunk. You might end up going home with different people. So the literal room to lean on your friends is just a lot lower. But secondly, when you're going on dates, that trades off with time that you could use talking to your friends about your experiences. And therefore, you have to cancel plans with them to a more significant extent, given everyone has competing obligations like schoolwork and jobs. Secondly, there's a high degree of stigma that's associated with going on many dates and hookups with other individuals. Firstly, because of slut-shaming narratives that empirically exist, particularly against women and queer men. But secondly, even if that's not true, you're trying to move on, meaning that you have care for them and don't want others to think this former relationship wasn't that important to me. So crucially, even if you can self-select into friends who won't think this of you or slut-shame you, you fear that other friends will think less of you by adopting op strategy and therefore are fearful of confiding in them to the same extent. But thirdly, even if you can access support networks to the same degree on both sides, there's just lower risk associated with our strategy, i.e., taking space is less active and doesn't come with the risks of things like reckless sex or bad dates. So your friends might not even give you good advice on their side of the house, i.e., some friends might say, fuck it, go be a hoe, and others might say, be careful. Whereas when you're taking space, it's relatively easier for friends to give good advice on how to introspect in a relatively meaningful way. That advice is more uncontroversial, right? Like exercise, don't drink excessively, stuff like that. Therefore, the quality of advice that you get on our side of the house is higher with regards to how you take time to introspect to figure out what you want in the long run. But this also already has a separate constructive impact because when you lean more on friends, you bond with them to a more significant extent. And crucially, this bonding often happens best during difficult periods where you have breakthrough conversations, learn more about what your friend's desires are and what your desires are, meaning that you create more stable friendships in the long run, which is more important than relationships, given that friendships are relatively more stable, whereas relationships are relatively more fickle due to things like the way that the brain works. Secondly, avoiding romantic and physical encounters with others prompts better introspection. This claim is simple. When you avoid these encounters, you do so with the explicit intention of reflecting on the relationship and improving on yourself. After all, you're trying to move on. Why does this introspection happen in good ways versus like launching into depressive spirals? Number one, because of all the framing that I already did. But number two, avoiding encounters with others doesn't mean you do nothing. You take your mind off of it in other ways, like going on runs or listening to music in cases where you do need space. Given that, introspection is good. Number one, because you have more headspace to unpack why you still have feelings for this person. So maybe you saw something in them that you had with a previous ex before them, or you find flaws and think about ways you are mistreating you that you literally just didn't identify before. And the second thing to point out is that you also have more room to think about what you did wrong. Remember, no one is perfect, not even you. You likely also fucked up in the relationship. Spending more time thinking about it also helps you recognize ways that you fucked up. Like, for example, you weren't communicating enough to a significant extent. By contrast, the introspection process is stifled on op side of the house for two reasons. One, when you seek out others, you often do it on the explicit self-justification of, I can do so much better. So you're not thinking about what you specifically did wrong. It's less reflective. But secondly, For ops impacts to clear, they must concede that you overcorrect, that you try not to think about it to a greater extent, that you adopt a relatively avoidant strategy, so you're never solving the underlying problem. What does that mean? When you come home late at night after a date, you feel exhausted, you wish you were with your ex, but you haven't committed to a strategy which facilitates understanding how to get over them in the first place. The impacts of this claim are simple. You have happier future relationships in two ways. One, you know what you want to a greater extent, and therefore you self-select into dating people who share those interests with you and who won't, for example, have the red flags that your ex did. But secondly, you know things that you do wrong too, like not communicating. And therefore, when you can better identify those issues on our side of the house, you better exercise those previously unhad skills and therefore have better future relationships. The weighing on this argument is simple. When you have more introspection and are just a better person overall, you can access any of op benefits later down the line, but to a greater extent. When you're more confident in what you want, the dates that you go on in the future will be like better and less exhausting. When you feel less self-loathing, you're less likely to make reckless decisions. Third argument, seeking many romantic and physical encounters with others too soon is terrible for you in three ways. One, there are inherent risks that come with seeking many relationships with others. So for example, hooking up a lot statistically increases your likelihood of getting an STI to a more significant extent. Secondly, when you date too soon after a breakup, that's also likely to go poorly for two reasons. One, you're in a bad headspace, meaning that you're more likely to accidentally talk about your ex on a date, which might alienate people to a more significant extent. They view you as like not having good like emotional intelligence. But secondly, you're sad, you're heartbroken. That means that you have low self-confidence. So you don't project yourself in as charismatic of a way, meaning that your date is less attracted to you and you have less of a click with each individual date that you are going on. Thirdly, in either scenario, seeking these encounters means you are more likely to turn back to your ex. Why? You're still not over them right now, given how recent the breakup was. What does that mean? When you go on these dates, when you seek out these hookups, you are comparing these people who you're interacting with to your ex who you're trying to get over. Issue, you can't find that. No one's going to be the same as you, your ex. So you inevitably turn back to them. You drunk text them, even though that would not be good for you. This is awful. Number one, because it decreases your self-esteem. When you have a bad sexual experience, a shitty date, or you go back to your ex, you feel unlovable. And this is cyclical, meaning that lower self-esteem makes it harder for you to move on. Secondly, there are independent negative impacts of, for example, bad sexual experiences, which outweigh not being able to get over your ex because they're more severe. For example, you might live in a conservative area where you cannot access sufficient testing. Thirdly, this is bad for other people because you are instrumentalizing other people for the purpose of getting over your own ex. The reason that you care about this principle is because lots of people hold the intuition that others are ends in and of themselves. So for example, it's wrong to manipulate people or lie to people. This is not a knife because op isn't a double bind. If you concede that you tell your hookups that you're trying to get over your ex, then that links into our impacts of bad dates. But if you don't, then we access our impact about instrumentalization.
I want to start by doing a lot of agreement with Matt, right? Firstly, what does it mean to be trying to get over your ex? Many people are perfectly happy when they exit a long-term relationship. They've already done the work to reconcile the pros and cons and decided to leave. But those people are already over their ex and the relationship as a whole. The actor in this debate clearly hasn't developed an emotional break from the prior relationship. Maybe they were the ones who were dumped. Maybe they made an emotionally charged decision. Maybe they made a decision they thought was right at the time, but they're now regretting it. And so they have to deal with these persistent memories of their ex. I'm going to actually just deal with Matt's case as they presented it, and I'm just going to deal clash by clash. Firstly, on social pressure and your friends. One, I think it is just like really like a wild overclaim to say that your friends will be willing to spend a ton of time with you and socially console you through all of this. Four problems. One, this assumes that your friends have time, they don't have work, they don't have school. Two, this assumes that their friends don't have their own messy relationships that are going to take preference. Three, this assumes that your friends have the emotional bandwidth to deal with this like these negative emotions and these traumas. And four, this assumes that your friends will give you helpful advice instead of just glib off the cuff advice. The vast majority of your friends are deeply unlikely to be savants or emotionally mature enough to give you good or relevant advice. But even if this is not the case, I can entirely flip this argument because your friends are almost categorically better positioned to give you advice on op side of the house than gov side of the house. Why? Your friends are probably not great at living the single life or helping you live the single life. Let's assume and be charitable that you have a few single friends. They will likely encourage you to go to bars and go to clubs. Remember, the gov in this debate needs to not only avoid long-term romantic relationships, but also sexual relationships like hookups. Why is this pressure incredibly likely from your friends? One, the established social norm after exiting a relationship is that there are plenty of fish in the sea. You go out and start fishing again. Two, mass media and social media strongly reinforce the trope that single people be like Barney in How I Met Your Mother or Carrie from Sex and the City. And here I just want to clash with this weird assertion about slut shaming. Point for point, I think every one of our friends is far more likely to roast us for getting no dick than they are to roast us for being a slut. And this is because the social norms and the social conventions of acceptability on what we're allowed to mock have radically changed over time. It is just objectively more acceptable to mock someone for being an incel than it is to mock someone for being promiscuous. But third, going to bars and clubs is fun for a lot of those other single friends too, so they have a selfish self-interest in asking you to join them. Look, it's possible that your friends will be cool staying inside, forgoing their own relationships and playing Catan with you, but it's not likely. Many of them will have their own relationships, their own snaky links. Many of them are inundated by media that glorifies those things, and they aspire to those same ends for their own personal benefit. But many of them also believe that being alone is not healthy for you because you were someone who did pretty okay when you were in a long-term relationship. And so there's a combination of selfless and selfish reasons your social problems will compound if you attempt to adhere to the fiat of the Gov. The only problem is the Gov's only response to these very reasonable characterization arguments is the arbitrary, I just don't want to meet new people right now. But this results in a ton of problems when it comes to communicating your preferences to your friends. One, they won't understand or respect the restriction, given that it does seem incredibly arbitrary. Two, they will continually pressure you on the question of, well, it's been 3 months, well, it's been 4 months, well, it's been 5 months, and the vast majority of the suggestions that they feel comfortable accessing or comfortable advocating for will be the op. Three, they don't know how best to help you if you insist on remaining single because, again, the only socially acceptable conventions they know are the op by definition. But four, they're just on the margins going to spend less time hanging out with you because they're going to see you as a killjoy, someone who doesn't comport with their ideas of what we should be doing when we're single in the city. Argument two is a new relationship is the best way for the actor to reconcile with themselves. I want to start out with a concession. The op doesn't particularly care if the new relationship succeeds or fails. Even a tentative flail at a relationship will access the benefits of these arguments and be sufficient for op to win the round. The self-doubt and recrimination that's likely to occur when you're pining over an ex is comparatively more likely to be solved even in the failure of a new relationship than it is to be solved in no relationship in isolation for 3 reasons. One, being alone gives you almost no positive reinforcement except for your friends. But in addition to all of the objections I described above, they have no ethos to critique your behavior in a relationship because you're not in a relationship with them. It is fundamentally different. There are epistemic uncertainties that they don't know and they can't access and they can't speak to. Two, being isolated typically causes pre-existing beliefs to build upon themselves in spirals. So if you believe that you did something bad in the relationship or you regret the relationship ending, the isolation is incredibly likely to reinforce those lingering feelings of attachment to your ex. And third, being alone results in still results in exposure to relationships, right? You're going to be on media, social media, your friends' relationship statuses. Like, let's be real. The likely scenario from the Gov is lying on your bed, scrolling through her Instagram posts. And that's the definition of a toxic spiral. Even a failed relationship has marginally more potential to solve back for these harms because communication still happens in the early stages of dating. You can still generate interlayered feedback loops, both with your friends and also with your new partners. Notably, your friends are more capable of discussing these things because they have more familiarity in discussing new relationships than they do in persistently remaining single. Also, in this instance, you have a new partner who presumably has the ethos to speak to your behavior in a relationship. But focusing on a new relationship also just occupies your headspace. You're thinking of your new partner, not your old one. And this is maybe the most critical warrant here. Because we have limited time and focus in this world, I would rather it not be focused on our ex. Look, these arguments aren't categorically true. Sometimes you'll be on a date and only think about your ex, and that sucks. But they are comparatively true, which is that if you are alone and your friends decided that they couldn't play Catan with you that night, you will almost certainly be pining over your ex's TikTok, and that's just the most unhealthy definition in the round. The other impact I want to explicitly clash for you is going back to your ex. All of these warrants are comparative to the question. Being like pining over your ex alone when there is no one to check back against you and no new relationship to distract you is far more likely to result in you going back to your ex. Simply because, at least on our side of the house, I have somebody else I could potentially text. Matt, I think, literally only has his ex. The weighing is simple. Almost all of these arguments are a prior burden to the government case. Stopping the isolation spiral that I described is a necessary but insufficient interrogatory step in clearing your head and looking to the future instead of the past, a necessary step to be happy. Our third argument is that this new relationship is just incredibly likely to succeed. Matt's, I think, big trick is, we can just do the op later. But it isn't sufficient because, notably, if doing the op now makes doing the op later better, that is a better long-term solvency than the one this Gov is able to provide. Why is trying to find a relationship now a more accelerated path to a successful relationship in the future? There are 4 reasons. One, you just objectively get more practice, right? You're able to understand how to operate in the early stages of a relationship. You're able to fall back into those new habits. You're able to maximize your probability of succeeding in the dating scene. Two, you are able to find people that you yourself are compatible with. You're able to understand your own preferences with respect to the dating scene and to understand which of those are directly tied to your ex and which of those are maybe more malleable, maybe more exogenous, things that you'd be willing to compromise on and things you'd be willing to change. Three, you can take these relationships as seriously or as unseriously as you want. This optionality beats a lot of Matt's negative impacts to being in a new relationship because I actually don't have to fall in love with this new person. I can just treat this as a casual hookup. I can just treat this as X. I can just treat this as Y. And because I have that ability and because I have a marginally greater ability to leverage my friend's expertise in determining whether or not I am making the marginal choice on commitment questions, I am far more better able to develop my relationship habits until I find someone I am compatible with, until I find someone I do want to lean in on. I think the only thing I need to respond to is this question of STDs. I'm just going to concede the question and outweigh it categorically. That's what doctors and clinics are for. We are incredibly proud to oppose.